So how old are you? Not you. How old are you?
7.
You're 7? That's a great age for learning about butterflies, don't you think? So, have you seen any out yet?
Maybe a white one.
Probably not, but
And one time I saw a monarch, like the common butterflies, like that one on the
that's a monarch. Yeah, we have monarchs on the West Coast. The ones on the East Coast that go down to Mexico every year get all the press, but we actually do have some monarchs out here.
There's that one too.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, hello everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm an adult services librarian here at the library, and I want to welcome you to Butterfly Friendly Gardens with OSU Master Gardener Kris LaMar. This program is scheduled to last about an hour. I have some exciting programs for you here in the audience, as well as live streaming with us today. Starting June 1st, we will have our summer reading program kickoff, where you can sign up, read books, earn awesome prizes, as well as just enjoy a summer of reading. All ages are welcome to participate. You can learn more on our library website and sign up using our Beanstack app. On Thursday, June 9th, we will be having our first Read Your Own Book Club walking group for adults. This is a non-traditional club where, instead of reading a predetermined type, participants share what they're currently reading or have read in order to get more recommendations. We'll meet at various locations in Westland, so please check our website for details. And then on Monday, June 27th at 7 p.m., our very own Cheryl Hill will be hosting an Introduction to Geocaching program. Learn about geocaching, the worldwide outdoor treasure hunt played by millions. Okay, that's it for me. I know you're really here to learn about butterflies, so I want to have you all help me welcome Kris LaMar.
Thank you, Sarah. I have to position this someplace that I can see. She can see me on the
You want us to
camera,
move over there?
and I can. That might work better.
Yeah,
Sure.
let's do that.
I appreciate you being in the front row because one of the really exciting things about giving talks to me is being able to have a conversation. So hopefully, if you have questions, you'll feel okay raising your hand. Will you do that for me? Okay, good. So Sarah indicated that yesterday Wesleyan Library had a program that you could adopt a cocoon, and it would live here, and you could track its progress in becoming an adult butterfly. And that's what we're going to talk about a little here today, but also how you can set up your garden so that you can have butterflies available. The butterflies are only one of many, many species of animals that are pollinators. And pollinators are important because a lot of the food that we eat requires pollination, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens. So what you just saw there was a monarch butterfly. And before we started today, we were talking just a little bit about monarch butterflies and whether you might have seen them already this year. Probably not. Most of the monarch butterflies that people talk about and are fascinated by are actually butterflies that live before they fly. They live in northern United States and the northeastern area, which includes the Canadian provinces that are there. And they migrate all the way down to Mexico. So they're really snowbirds, but they're butterflies. And there are some really wonderful documentaries about that you want to see their journeys. That's not what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about whether they can, if they do they journey through your backyard, and are you presenting them with a place that they can prosper and continue the species. So this is the life cycle of a monarch butterfly. It's actually the life cycle of most butterflies. Butterflies and moths are both members of a family called Lepidoptera. That's a long word. And it's very unique because, if you notice, we start at the top of their life cycle, and that's a little bitty egg. And the little bitty egg rests for a while on a specific kind of plant. Do you happen to know what kind of plant monarch butterflies have to have?
Milkweed.
Milkweed. And it's really a shame that they call it a weed, because weeds don't really mean anything scientifically. It's usually a plant that you don't want in your yard. Unfortunately, because we call them milkweeds, people tend to want to pull them because they think they don't want them in their yards. But if we didn't have milkweed plants, we wouldn't have monarch butterflies. That's the only plant that the adult female, which you'll see up at the top right, actually will lay eggs on. So if she can't find any milkweed, she dies without carrying on the species. So after a while, the egg develops, and if you see top left, looks like a striped caterpillar, and that, in fact, what it is, a caterpillar. Caterpillars are little eating machines. One of the reasons that people tend to want to get rid of caterpillars in their yards, in their gardens, is because they eat leaves. Now, obviously, the milkweed people don't care about so much, but they also eat things like cabbage leaves and spinach leaves. And they even eat leaves off of some trees and shrubs. But they have to eat to get to the next stage in their life cycle. And they then go, if you follow the arrows around, they go into what's called a pupa, or what you've probably heard of as a chrysalis. This is just what butterflies do. In the chrysalis, they lose all but 3 of their body parts. They literally become liquid, and they completely change their form, which is what the term metamorphosis means. Meta means shape, morphos means change. So they undergo a complete metamorphosis, and they're in that chrysalis for just a relatively short period of time, and then they start, you'll see, wriggling around in there, and as they, hello, come on in. We're on slide number 2, so you haven't missed anything. So at the chrysalis stage, as I said, they're really not doing anything. They're just really resting, but they're doing a lot of things that you can't see, and they're changing their form. Eventually, the chrysalis will start moving, and it breaks open, and next thing you know, you will see a butterfly hanging from the twig or branch that the leaf was on, that the caterpillar was eating. And then as they emerge, at least you can see right here in the 3 o'clock position, as they emerge, the adult butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, and it shakes itself off. It's wet, needs to get dried out so that its wings will fly. Now here's kind of an interesting factoid about many insects, but particularly caterpillars. Their wings have muscles that have to be somewhere in the temperature range of about 55 degrees. So when they're adults, you'll only see them flying when their wings have reached that temperature, which is one reason that we don't see a lot of butterflies flying in the morning. And that may be good for some consequences down the line. And then they fly away and they mate and lay more eggs, and the cycle starts all over again. And with monarchs, that takes a year. Other butterfly species have shorter life cycles, so you may see 2 or 3 different cycles during the course of one end of winter to beginning of winter cycle. So you can divide both of the life cycle stages, if you will, into 2 categories. They're either eating, where they need food, or they're trying to continue the species, so sex. So when we talk about habitat, what we're trying to explain is a way for them to have what they need during their life cycle. And a habitat for an insect isn't really all that different from habitats from other animals. Humans have houses, or tents or igloos, and they use it at different times for different purposes. Sometimes they're eating, sometimes they're sleeping, etc., etc. So what we're trying to do in providing a habitat for butterflies is to think of all their needs and how we can protect them and enhance them so we continue to have butterflies. One of the things that's important to do is to plant native flowering plants. And the handout that we gave you has a list of quite a few plants that you could plant in your garden, which would be helpful for them in either the sex or the food stage. These are, I suspect, plants that you recognize. Obviously, the rhododendron are our favorite. We have, I can't see from my position over here. It looks like Ceanothus is probably on the left. And I've forgotten the one in the middle. I just passed about 100 of them when I was driving here. And then, of course, the red flowering currant down at the bottom. So each of these is either a source of nectar. If we were talking about bees, we would talk about them being a source of both pollen and nectar, because particularly honeybees take both the pollen and the nectar back to their hives. But butterflies aren't at all interested in the pollen. They happen to be pollinators because they're in the right place at the right time. But what they're really trying to do is to get water and the sugar that the nectar is comprised of. So the food part of it is why you want color and you want plants that have blooms that have a lot of nectar particularly. But they're also important for planting in your yard so that you're providing what we would call a habitat during the time that they are either in their cocoons or as eggs, and particularly when they're eating. So you want to have plants that they have become accustomed to eating, or as in the case of the milkweed, they have to have that particular species of plant. And so you're providing a larval environment for them. You're providing a host environment for them during the time that they're not eating and they're not flying, but equally important stages in their life cycle as either of those other two. Now, the plant type and color is important, particularly the flowers. What do you think that thing is on the right? Does that look like anything you have in your garden? No? Well, it's got pretty bright colors, doesn't it? What do you think is the major color right there? Yellow, that's right. Well, this is what a yellow flower looks like to a butterfly, the adult butterfly that's flying. They don't have very good vision in terms of being able to sort out where each of the petals are, etc. But they are very able to see specific colors, far better probably than can we. And so the most important colors to have in your garden are plants that have orange, red, pink, yellow, and purple flowers. Now, look at that flower really carefully and pretend that you're a pilot and you're landing an airplane. Can you see how the stripes might act like pointers to where the nectar and the pollen are? And this is true of a lot of insects. They're drawn to flowers that have two different colors, but that point them to the target area. Now, the flower doesn't really care whether it's a butterfly or a hummingbird or a bee or a wasp. They're more interested in making sure that there's some source available. It could even be a human who's going to pollinate and keep the species going. But from the butterfly's perspective, or the bee, or the hummingbird, whatever, they're just there for the food. And because they work so well with each other, it's important that you have the plants that are the same ones that are going to attract the insects so that both of those species can continue to thrive. Second thing is to have a wide landing pad. Now this wouldn't be true for flies or wasps or bees, but particularly for butterflies, they need to have a place that they can rest right there on the flower itself. And having a narrow tube is important, so you'll often see, much as you will with hummingbirds, you'll see butterflies going for things like fuchsia, which have the long tubes. Now that's kind of the opposite of a landing pad, but they can adapt their bodies so that they are able to access it. And they're often very smart about waiting until the time of day when the flower is open the widest so that they can access the pollen and the nectar. In some ways, they're far smarter than are we. Don't tell them that. They're also interested in having an odor, and again, although I think it's probably difficult to measure, there have been studies that indicate that their ability to identify a specific species that they are interested in getting food as a food source from, is their noses are better than ours. But they can also recognize that there's no scent, in which case the color sense prevails. Ample nectar, obviously, deeply hidden will be fine, and in some part because if it's deeply hidden, it's less likely to evaporate. And there's going to be more of it. It's congregated in a smaller space. And the season depends on the species. As I said, some butterfly species actually have more than one life cycle per year, but you'll be able to have a continual source of the nectar for them during all of these life stages. I haven't seen any butterflies yet this year. I've seen lots of flies. The mason bees all seem to have done their job and are holed up in their tubes. But it'll be a few more weeks until most of our common butterflies, at least in this area, have gotten their wings. Now, planting good nectar sources in the sun is important. One of the reasons that it's important is because they can see better when there's a lot of sunlight. The exception to this is the other member of the Lepidoptera family, and that is the moths. Moths are, frankly, pollinators, just as important as the butterflies, but you'll see butterflies during the day, and they need these important sources of bright light so that they can see the colors. Moths, on the other hand, although they're drawn to outdoor lamps at night, they do the pollination at night, and they're actually more attracted to the light colors, or white flowers, which pick up ambient light or from light that you have next to your door, for example. And then, if you're going to develop a pollinator garden, including ones to benefit butterflies, one of the things that you need to think about, if you look at this really closely, there are lots of trees and tall shrubs in the background. Particularly if you have a hill that you're planting your pollinator garden on, you want to make sure that the wind doesn't come and blow off the pollen or dry out the plants that are planted toward the front. So you put the tallest plants on the back and the lowest plants in front in as sunny a region as you can. The other thing about this type of setup is you can remember, if you recall the three sisters in your vegetable garden, that you have a cornstalk that acts as a trellis. For the beans or peas, the legumes that grow up around it, so you don't need to trellis your corn. And then you have squash plants around the bottom that help keep the soil cool and moist. So it's essentially the same design and is often found in nature where you didn't have any human gardeners out there at all. Then you want to plant for a continuous bloom. And this is out of Minnesota, but I represent to you that the type of plants that they have in Minnesota are probably not all that different from the ones that we have out here, particularly since we're both in northern hemispheric areas. Swamp milkweed, we don't have swamp milkweed out here. We do have Asclepsia, and Oregon actually has 3 different native types of milkweed. One is along the Columbia Gorge, one of the varieties. Another one is here in the Willamette Valley, and there's actually a third in southwest Oregon. So one of the important things when you're thinking of planting for continuous bloom is also to think, is this a variety or a species that may not be native in our area, but it's one that the insects, the pollinators, recognize as a species that they would be interested in utilizing. And in general, the older the species of plant, and they're more likely to be native, the more valuable they're going to be to our pollinators, and butterflies in particular, because over millions of years, they've learned to work with each other. It's like a long-term marriage, and they benefit one to the other in the same way that the pollen and the nectar are mutually advantageous to both the plant and the insect. But having plants for continuous bloom is important because if you have a one bloom wonder, it's only going to be available in an asset to the pollinator, the butterfly, for a short period of time. The other thing that's helpful is to get plants that can be pruned, headed as we call them, so that they will continue to bloom over the entire season. Now you have to keep up with that. One of the ones that I've had the most luck in doing that with is Peter, Paul, and Mary. It's Peter's last name.
From the group?
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
I can't ever remember the name of the plant, but I remember Peter, Paul, Mary. It's yarrow.
Oh.
And sure enough, they have a
I didn't know there'd be trivia here, sorry.
Oh, I know. You would have brought your iPad, right? Yeah. It looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace in that it's a very tiny little flowers at the top, but you can prune it 4 or 5 times during the season, and it'll keep coming back. So you can't just plant them and forget them if you want to have a successful pollinator garden, and especially for butterflies. Because not all pollinators and not all butterflies, because all of them don't die at the end of October, having planted or having laid their eggs someplace, it's also important that you keep some plants in your landscape that will provide flowers, therefore pollen, during the course of the winter. Now, obviously, it's not going to be nearly so prolific as it is in the spring and summer and into the fall, but the top plant, the yellow plant on the top right, is the Mahonia, the Oregon grape, which happens to be our state flower. The heather or heaths are the purple ones that you see there in the middle. And they're kind of interesting because you're starting to prune them after they have bloomed, and that's almost exactly the same time as you're going to start seeing blooms coming out on the other native and beneficial plants. So the general rule, this is just in terms of pruning generally, if not only the annual plants but also the shrubs and the trees, you never want to prune until the plant is flowering. Not just for the pollinators, but for the plant itself. So just a general rule you can take home and say, I'm waiting until the flowers are gone for the pollinators. Let me point out something else. We don't have it on here, but do you ever wonder why people hate dandelions so much? If you look back, they're yellow. It's a flat flower. It's large enough, and it has wonderful sources, particularly of nectar, not quite so much pollen, actually. Now, at the stage where you have this quote-unquote ugly yellow dandelion flower, you can often, if you just stay back and observe for a while, see many, many pollinators there. But that's the same time your neighbor's out mowing theirs down in their yard. And they're probably not going to be real excited if you let all of yours grow. Because then your little flowers are going to turn to seeds, and they're going to migrate over to your neighbor's property, and they'll have more to mow next year. I make a suggestion. In favor of the pollinators, leave the flower. When you see it's about to go to seed, it'll start getting, you can tell, dry out. Then cut it off. You've benefited the pollinators with a plant that we just don't like, so it's a plant in a place that we don't want it, so we call it a weed. Ditto clover. Clover is an excellent source of nectar. But we try to get it out of our yards, our manicured yards, that quite frankly do nothing at all for pollinators. In fact, manicured yards actually prevent bees, not so many butterflies, but bees, from creating underground nests. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% of all of our 400 native bees nest underground. Not in hives, not even in honey pots that you've seen our native our native bees. Now if you take nothing else home, don't go buy insecticides. I'm going to enlarge this topic just a bit, just to make a few definitions here. A pesticide is kind of an umbrella term for anything that kills a pest. A pest is something, whether it's a plant or a fungus or a bacteria or an animal, in a place that humans don't want that whatever to be. So we try to kill it. We may not want to eliminate the entire species, but we want it out of our habitat, out of our area. So insecticides are some type of killer of insects. Insects or animals. Insecticides are either meant to target one type of insect at one or more stages of that insect's life cycle, or they're rather broad form, and they may last so long that they last into the next life cycle stage of one or more species of insects. The insecticides that are listed here, malathion, 7, and diazinon, are marketed to kill insects. The label is the law. Before you buy anything, I'm going to show you some other kinds of insecticides that are still potentially problematic, but they're not marketed quite so widely. And these are all chemicals that are meant to, in most cases, paralyze the insect. You don't want to use any of these materials in or near the butterfly garden, or better, anywhere on your property. And one of the problems with insecticides, particularly sprays and dusts, is that the wind carries them elsewhere. And although some of us are very committed to following the law, we don't read labels as closely as we should. And the terms are often very confusing. So they will tell you that it has a half-life of such and such, or do not enter the area that you've applied to for X period of time. And that's true for any animal, including the insects. That could include your pets, your grandchildren, anything that will get in that area, and some of these can be absorbed through the skin, but most often you lick them off and they get in your food, even worse. And even benign insecticides such as Bacillus thuringiensis are lethal to butterflies at the time that they're caterpillars. Bacillus thuringiensis is actually a bacteria that's in all the soil out here. It's a natural bacteria. But it has a chemical in it that makes it an insecticide by this paralysis. It's somehow incorporated into the body of the insect, and then it kills the insect. And they're everywhere, but you can buy concentrated amounts of it and apply it, and it'll work quite well. It's technically organic, but organic pesticides are just as lethal as anything created by any of the big chemical companies. So be sure you read the label before you apply it in or near a place that you're trying to protect as habitat for butterflies and other pollinators. So if you absolutely have to apply a pesticide, which you need to think long and hard whether you really need to, or whether there are other techniques that you can use instead of applying a chemical, don't spray during a bloom. Wait until after the bloom's gone. You're going to cut down on the chances, the odds, that any pollinator, but particularly butterflies, which have a fairly short time span that they're able to fly and go from bloom to bloom, if you can just hold off, ignore the pest for a while, you can get by much better, and you're more likely not to impact the community. Don't allow the spray to drift onto blooming weeds, including clover and dandelions, and anything else that you may have labeled as being a weed in your yard. Now, I said clover, by the way. OSU has been one of the pioneering institutions in terms of coming up with micro clover and other types of lawns that benefit pollinators, they can still be mowed in the same way. And you're getting a double benefit. Your yard isn't as full of dandelions, hopefully, because it's full of clover. But it will just buzz all season. So when you think about whether it's a weed or not, maybe redefining what you want in your yard or in your landscape would be better than following everybody else's path in planting turf grass. Don't use soil drenches or tree trunk injections. A soil drench is an insecticide, can be any kind of pesticide, but in our case we're talking about insects, that is diluted and then poured around some soil. Obviously, tree trunk injections are where actually they take a needle and put it into the tree trunk. The problem with both soil drenches and injections into tree trunks is that that chemical then spreads to every cell in the plant, including the blooms, including the leaves that would otherwise have been very good larval hosts for butterflies. Because when they turn into caterpillars, they eat it, and there's the chemical, and it kills them. Now, it's true, you're not going to have notched leaves on whatever plant you apply this around, but you're also going to have a lot of dead or insects and caterpillars that never made it to adulthood. And then avoid spraying flowers with fungicides. A fungicide is, as I alluded to, anything that kills a fungus. A fungus isn't a plant, it's not an animal. Fungi actually have their own kingdom. There's the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the fungus kingdom, and several other kingdoms of related organisms that we don't have to go into, but things like bacteria. So they're even broken down into their own kingdoms. Fungi are important. They're absolutely critical to the existence of animals and plants because we live on plants, and plants need fungi to help them make it through their life cycles. If I were to go out and pick a tree, right outside, pick any tree, if I dug it up, next to the roots of that plant, I would probably find a fungus that works cooperatively with the plant's roots and goes out and brings back nutrients for that plant. They live in a very interesting existence. Now, if I'm putting soil drenches, I'm probably killing some of those fungi as well. But a lot of people think that if they just spray a fungicide on, for example, in spring, a rose bush, you're going to get, you probably have seen black spot on your roses in the spring, which is just a fungus that's growing on the leaf. The part of the fungus that is bringing back that food to the fungus itself are called hyphae. You've seen it when you've turned over a log and you've seen these little gray or white tendrils that go out. They're actually able to penetrate cell walls. So if you use a fungicide on a flower, really any part of the plant, you are killing the fungus, but you are also making it more probable that that is going to kill a part of the plant that's valuable to our butterflies and other pollinators. So using fungicides wisely is something that's recommended, again, if you have to use it at all. And then, how do we feed butterfly caterpillars? Again, they're at that eating stage where the last thing you want is one of them munching on your vegetable garden. However, if you were to plant, as I suggested, the native plants, those will be the larval hosts, and in many cases they'll be drawn away from an alternate vegetable garden resource, if they're not particularly particular, and you won't have to worry about it quite so much. But these are some of the plants that we have native in our environment: lupin, mallow, and manzanita. Manzanita is a tree, obviously, and in parentheses are the butterfly species that use those native plants as a host plant, either for the flowers or for the foliage to live there, or both. So think about what plants you have in your garden. Some of these, especially the mallow and the lupin, are available in commercial gardening places, but we do have varieties here in the state that are in this entire region. They're native, so you need not go there. If you just take a trip to one of the national forests, you might be able to find them for the cost of a permit. And then because butterflies have a larger mass, they may not weigh much more, but they have a larger mass than do other types of pollinators like bees and flies and wasps. They use a lot of energy that they've just managed to pick up from the pollen, or excuse me, from the nectar that they've eaten. They use a lot of that just getting from place to place. So providing them a place to rest, particularly in the sun, where they can warm up their wing muscles again. And if you have both a plant that has a flower that has a lot of pollen and it's in, or, excuse me, nectar, and it's in the sun and it's flat, you're helping to provide habitat for them that'll keep them at least healthy during their very brief period of adulthood when they're flying. I took this from an article, and when I first read it, I thought it said, give them a place for pudding. I thought, I have never heard of pudding used in the same sentence as any horticultural thing, but okay. And then I put on my glasses and it said puddling. Oh, okay. So one of the things that butterflies like to do is to drink, not just the nectar, but they'll drink from a source of water if it's not flowing too quickly, because they can't rest, they just get washed away. And so on the left side is probably as close to a natural puddling place as I could find on the internet. And it's just a place where there's a pond, there's an area that has plants that they can rest on and drink at the same time that they're resting and sunning and warming up. The one on the right actually is one that a fellow master gardener puts out in the spring every year. It has moss on top of rocks, so it has a resting place. There are actually 7 different varieties of bees on this bubbler. And the bubbler keeps the water aerated so it doesn't get stagnant. The moss helps to clean the water at the same time and provides a surface that they can rest on without getting blown away, etc. And it's in the sun, so you need to provide enough water that it doesn't evaporate quickly. We used to have a lot of bubblers, I thought, but I haven't seen many at the garden centers. But if you're creative enough to make some, why, this is something they really need, especially during and following heat domes. Yes, ma'am?
And it should be in the sun? Is that what you just said?
It should be in the sun,
Okay.
because you're providing them the warmth, correct. They also feel safer if they're in open spaces. Yeah, some insects remain hidden. Butterflies like to be out there, showing off their beauty. That's right. They don't have much time in the beauty pageant, so they want to take as much time as they can and get all the publicity they can. And then an overwintering habitat, because this is limited to a fairly limited number of varieties of butterflies, but many of them do actually pupate over the winter, so they're there, but you don't know that they're there. But they have to be safe places to protect them from predators, because we have birds all year round. Someplace that they're safe. One of the suggestions, and this photograph on the left is actually from the the Smithsonian. They have beautiful gardens there. And one of the things that they do that many wildlife organizations promote is to leave the leaves and don't cut down your ornamental grasses in the fall. Ornamental grasses, some of them produce and distribute large amounts of seeds. that you may not want in your garden, so you might want to read up on the species of ornamental grass that you're planting in the first place. But those seeds are often used as a source of food for particularly birds, but also as resting places. Now, this isn't true of butterflies, but some pollinators actually, if you've ever seen a mason bee tube, other bees and pollinators lay their eggs in the tube that's left after the ornamental grass dies. So if you will leave it over the course of the winter, you may be providing a place for the mama to lay eggs, which will then pupate over the winter and become whatever adult species they will become naturally in the spring or early summer. This structure on the right, a hugelkultur, as you can imagine, comes from German. What they're trying to do is to create a wild environment artificially. But they're using totally natural sources. So if you cut down a tree, and you can dig out, excavate. If you excavate, then you're probably trying to attract more wildlife like snakes that need a place to hibernate over the winter. If you just pile it on top of the ground, though, you're creating a safe space, and many butterfly species will pupate through this safe environment over the winter. They don't need water, they don't need sun, but they do need shelter. I learned about this early on in my work as a master gardener, and we just bought a house that I have the cultivated acre, and my husband has Appalachia West, so we have it divided in two. But I leave a portion of my yard. It's, I don't know, probably 20 by 60 feet. It's kind of a triangle. I throw all of my spent plants, my weeds, all my prunings in the spring. I never walk in the area. I called it my wild zone. So I have kind of a variation of this hugelkultur. And I've counted, when I've gone in there very carefully, 17 ground nests of insects that aren't being disturbed. They don't have to work their way through a turf grass barricade. And the area is always just teeming with wildlife. So we're not doing nature any favors by having clean landscapes. Nature's dirty. Nature's really messy. And that will promote pollinators, and particularly the butterflies. Now these are some, if you come back to this later, or if you want to write them down, these are some of the resources that you might want to look into that come from two different sources. The first two come from Oregon State, its Extension Publication Service. Obviously, although this wasn't about hummingbirds, the butterfly garden one and the information about attracting hummingbirds is almost exactly the same in several ways. And then Gardening for Wildlife from the National Wildlife Federation is really an excellent one. I think the pictures, whether they're butterflies or hummingbirds or whatever else, of the resources that they draw from beauty that we're so attracted to. So they're not the monarchs that we saw initially, or even the moths that are at night and they're pretty boring, but they're part of our wildlife community. And hopefully you'll take some of these suggestions and make a safe habitat for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Just go to these resources.
You did all a great job at asking your questions during the time. I did want to recommend two books while we were talking really fast. First is Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, that you were speaking about fungi and the society that's basically built under it.
Mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah, that too. And then Beyond the War on Invasive Species by Tao Ryan. She's actually local. That changed my perspective on especially dandelions, but they're often there to serve a purpose. And they're telling you what's going on with your soil. And like you said, what's one weed somewhere is not a weed somewhere else. So I thought that that would be an interesting perspective if you wanted to come to terms with your weed population and your backyard habitat. But
The other thing is, and we're not trained in this as master gardeners, but there's a plethora of information out there about how some of these weeds are actually either sources of food for us, dandelion tea,
or wine,
or
if you want to
wine.
go
That's
there.
right. That's right. And dandelion leaves can be used in place of spinach or
Super
lettuce,
nutritious, yeah.
and many of them have medicinal. So killing it just because you don't happen to like its shape or color is no excuse for tampering with nature.
Well, I have a question, because I was down at is it Silver Falls?
Silver Falls,
And
yeah.
there were these little, I think they were butterflies, but they're about an inch across and blue, a pretty kind
You might have been seeing the azure.
was it azure, what?
Azure.
What, is there another part of it, or just azures?
I think they're called blue azures.
Blue azure?
I mentioned them earlier.
Is that redundant?
Pardon me?
Is that a redundant name?
Yeah, it is, but some people don't know the word azure.
Okay.
You know. I mentioned them
Oh, I must have missed
earlier.
it. Oh.
Yeah, as one of the plants that serves as a larval host for them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think I did.
They were enjoying, there were puddles, so that's
Yes.
what they were kind of hopping around.
That's right. So, see, puddling.
Yeah. So this is great.
Thank
you.
goodness for
Yeah.
Silver Falls.
Yeah.
A great resource for a lot of reasons.
Oh, man, yeah. Just wonderful. It's
It is.
beautiful.
Good.